Imagine a history where building a life, a home, or even a thriving community could be met with sudden violence simply because of the color of your skin. Black Americans have endured systemic oppression, massacres, and racial terror throughout history, stretching from the turbulent years after Reconstruction all the way to the modern era. These were not isolated incidents but part of a long, painful pattern of inequality, fear, and brutality designed to suppress progress, silence voices, and maintain control. From small towns to bustling cities, communities that dared to prosper often faced destruction, leaving scars that echo through generations. Think of thriving neighborhoods, schools, and businesses suddenly engulfed in flames, families forced to flee for their lives, and communities erased from maps and memory. Behind every statistic of death or destruction lies the lived experience of ordinary people, parents trying to protect their children, neighbors risking everything to stand together, and everyday individuals striving for justice in an environment stacked against them. The stories are heartbreaking, yet they are a testament to resilience, courage, and the unyielding desire for freedom and equality. But why should this history matter to us today? Because understanding these events is essential to understanding how society has been shaped, why disparities persist, and what we must do to ensure such injustices are never repeated. By learning about these moments of courage, resistance, and tragedy, we honor those who suffered and paved the way for a more just and informed society. Knowledge is power, and history, no matter how painful, provides the lessons we need to recognize injustice, fight for fairness, and build communities where everyone can thrive. In this video, we are going to journey through some of the most significant and devastating events in Black American history. We will explore how systemic oppression manifested in acts of violence, how communities responded, and the lasting impact these events have had on generations. But more than that, we will reflect on what these histories teach us about resilience, justice, and the ongoing fight for equality. You will meet real people whose courage shines through even in the darkest of times, and we will examine how their stories continue to inspire movements and change today. Before we dive in, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. By doing, you are not only supporting our mission to bring these important stories to light, but you are also joining a community committed to learning, reflection, and action. Every click helps spread awareness, encourages conversation, and ensures that these stories are remembered, not hidden, not ignored, and certainly not erased. Get ready to uncover a history of resilience, courage, and lessons that resonate far beyond the pages of textbooks. Let us begin this journey together. And remember, the more we understand our past, the better equipped we are to shape a future that truly values justice and equality for all. In the early years of the 20th century, Atlanta was a city alive with ambition, growth, and promise. A place where the echoes of Reconstruction still lingered, but where new opportunities seemed to beckon to all who were willing to seize them. Black residents, despite the heavy weight of systemic oppression, had begun to carve out spaces of prosperity and community within the city, establishing businesses, social networks, and vibrant neighborhoods that reflected both resilience and aspiration. The black middle class was emerging, and with it came a sense of pride, accomplishment, and hope for future generations. A hope that threatened the fragile comfort of the entrenched white elite who had long dictated the social and economic order. Yet, in the summer of 1906, that hope became the target of a forceful, violent backlash that would leave an indelible scar on the city and its people. The spark that ignited this tragedy came from newspapers whose sensationalized reporting stoked fear, prejudice, and anger, casting black men as dangerous and morally corrupt, and framing false stories of assaults against white women as a justification for immediate, unbridled retribution. These reports spread like wildfire through the city, inflaming tensions that had been quietly simmering beneath the surface. Atlanta's white residents, gripped by a mixture of fear, envy, and a desire to maintain societal dominance, organized into mobs that surged through black neighborhoods with terrifying speed and ferocity. Armed with the tools of destruction and the conviction that their actions were righteous and justified, over the course of several days, these mobs destroyed homes, shops, and churches, leaving streets scarred with smoke, ash, and the echoes of screams. Families were torn from their homes, some fleeing into the shadows of alleys or seeking refuge with neighbors, while others faced a brutal fate at the hands of those who viewed them not as human beings, but as symbols of perceived social and economic threat. The violence was indiscriminate and relentless, sparing neither age nor gender, and it created a climate of terror that reverberated far beyond the immediate streets of Atlanta. The black residents who survived were left to grapple not only with the loss of loved ones and property, but with the painful realization that the institutions meant to protect citizens had failed them. That law enforcement and local authorities had either participated in or turned a blind eye to the atrocities unfolding before their eyes. For decades, this massacre was quietly buried beneath layers of historical omission and selective memory, a chapter in Atlanta's history that few dared to confront and even fewer were willing to acknowledge publicly. The official records minimized the death toll, often listing only those whose names were unavoidable in legal or governmental accounts, while the stories passed down through families. Oral histories and community memory painted a far darker picture of devastation, grief, and loss. The scale of destruction, the depth of fear, and the human cost were all far greater than the pages of official reports suggested. And for generations, the massacre remained a painful secret whispered among those who had lived through it or whose ancestors had endured its horrors. It was not until the dawn of the 21st century that the city of Atlanta and broader society began to fully reckon with the events of 1906. On the 100th anniversary of the massacre, public commemorations, scholarly research, and renewed educational efforts brought the story into the light, demanding acknowledgement of the lives lost, the communities shattered, and the social and political forces that had made such violence possible. Scholars and historians began to contextualize the massacre not as an isolated act of spontaneous rage, but as the culmination of decades of systemic oppression, economic jealousy, and the deliberate manipulation of public fear to maintain racial hierarchies. The narrative that had once been obscured by silence and misinformation was now reconstructed with rigor, compassion, and an unflinching commitment to truth, ensuring that the black residents who had perished or survived would not be forgotten, and that their experiences would inform future generations about the enduring consequences of racial injustice. As we reflect on the Atlanta massacre, it becomes clear that the events were not only a tragedy of the moment, but also a lens through which to understand broader patterns in American history. The massacre illustrates how misinformation, fear, and entrenched social hierarchies can combine to produce moments of extreme violence. How communities striving for progress can be met with hostility and brutality, and how historical memory can be shaped, suppressed, and eventually reclaimed. By examining these events in detail, we honor the resilience of those who lived through them, acknowledge the depth of the injustices committed, and gain insight into the persistent challenges that continue to shape society today. The massacre is a somber reminder that progress is never guaranteed, that vigilance and education are essential, and that the stories of those who suffered must be told with honesty, care, and a commitment to justice. In revisiting Atlanta in 1906, we are invited not only to witness a moment of profound historical violence, but also to consider the broader implications of systemic oppression and the ways in which communities can recover, remember, and ultimately reclaim their narratives. The lessons of the past are never simply historical, they are living guides that challenge us to confront inequity. Question misinformation, and act with compassion and courage in our own time, ensuring that the voices silenced in 1906 resonate loudly in the present and shape a more just future for generations to come. Just 17 years after the devastating violence in Atlanta, another thriving black community faced a tragedy that would become both a symbol of resilience and a haunting reminder of the dangers that prosperity could invite in a racially divided society. In the early 1920s, the small town of Rosewood, Florida, stood as a testament to the determination and industriousness of its African American residents. Families had built homes, cultivated businesses, and fostered a tightly knit community where children played freely. Churches offered spiritual and social guidance, and neighbors looked out for one another with a shared sense of pride and security. Life in Rosewood, though not free from the broader constraints of systemic oppression, was peaceful, prosperous, and full of promise, a rare sanctuary in an era still burdened by pervasive racial fear and discrimination. This fragile equilibrium was shattered on a cold morning in January 1923, when rumors began to circulate of an alleged attack on a white woman by a black man. In an instant, whispered accusations escalated into fear. And fear, as it so often did in those times, became justification for violent action. The rumors traveled quickly, inflaming the minds of white residents in neighboring towns who had long harbored suspicions, resentments, and prejudices. Within hours, armed mobs descended upon Rosewood, their intentions clear and merciless. Homes that had once stood as symbols of achievement and community were set ablaze. Businesses that had served as lifelines for the town were looted or destroyed. And the familiar streets of Rosewood became a battlefield where survival was uncertain and death lurked at every turn. Amidst the chaos, the residents of Rosewood faced impossible choices. Some fled into nearby swamps, seeking refuge in dense thickets or relying on the mercy of neighbors willing to hide them, while others, unable to escape, confronted the intruders with courage and desperation, attempting to defend their homes and families. One man, Sylvester Carrier, exemplified this spirit, taking up arms to protect his community, engaging in a confrontation that resulted in the deaths of 2 white attackers, but also fueled the escalation of violence, drawing hundreds more into the mob's destructive sweep. The attacks continued relentlessly for 3 days, leaving the town in smoldering ruins and shattering the sense of security that had once defined Rosewood. The official death toll, as recorded by authorities, was a mere fraction of the human cost, listing only a handful of black and white victims. Yet survivors' accounts told a far darker story, one that included many more deaths, families torn apart, and the horrifying possibility of unmarked graves where bodies were hastily buried to obscure the true scale of the massacre. These narratives, passed down through generations, carried the weight of grief, injustice, and the profound disillusionment that comes when those entrusted with maintaining law and order either fail to intervene or, worse, tacitly approve of the violence. The erasure of accurate records, the suppression of witness testimony, and the deliberate minimization of casualties ensured that Rosewood would remain largely absent from mainstream historical accounts for decades, its story hidden beneath layers of silence and denial. It was not until the 1980s, when investigative journalists and historians began to meticulously reconstruct the events through interviews, archival research, and cross-referencing of scattered reports, that the full magnitude of the Rosewood Massacre emerged. Survivors finally found a voice, able to recount their experiences publicly, and the nation was forced to confront the reality of what had occurred: a prosperous black town destroyed, lives lost, and generations affected by trauma, displacement, and the lingering fear that safety could never be guaranteed. The delayed acknowledgement of the atrocity culminated in 1994, when the Florida legislature took the extraordinary step of compensating the few remaining survivors. A symbolic act meant to recognize the wrongs committed decades earlier, even if no amount of restitution could fully undo the suffering endured. The Rosewood Massacre serves as both a stark warning and a powerful testament to the resilience of communities facing systemic oppression. It demonstrates how fear, prejudice, and unchecked rumor can rapidly escalate into violence, and how the destruction of black prosperity was often a deliberate tool used to reinforce social hierarchies and maintain white supremacy. At the same time, the eventual uncovering of the massacre as truth, the stories of survival, and the pursuit of restitution decades later underscore the importance of memory. Historical accountability, and the persistence of justice even in the face of long-delayed recognition. By reflecting on Rosewood, we gain a deeper understanding of the patterns that connect this tragedy to other events in American history: the Atlanta Massacre, Springfield, and countless other instances where black communities' achievements provoked fear and retaliation. We see the profound human cost of societal indifference and the moral imperative to preserve and honor stories that have long been marginalized or suppressed. The legacy of Rosewood is not merely a record of destruction. It is a call to action, a reminder that vigilance, education, and empathy are essential to preventing the repetition of such horrors, and that the courage and resilience of those who endured such violence must continue to inspire efforts toward justice, equality, and the protection of human dignity for all communities. In the sweltering summer of 1908, the city of Springfield, Illinois, a place often regarded as calm and orderly, became the stage for a harrowing chapter in American racial history. A chapter that would reveal both the fragility of justice and the explosive consequences of prejudice left unchecked. The spark for this tragedy was deceptively simple yet deeply rooted in the fears and tensions of the time. Two black men, George Richardson and Joe James, were accused of crimes that, while serious, demanded legal scrutiny and due process. In a moment that should have affirmed the principles of fairness and the rule of law, authorities decided to secretly move the men from jail to protect them from an enraged white mob determined to enact vigilante justice. This act of protection, intended to uphold justice, instead ignited an unprecedented wave of fury among segments of the white population who could not tolerate the idea of black men receiving even the most basic legal rights. Rumors, half-truths, and sensationalized stories fanned the flames of fear and resentment, transforming ordinary citizens into participants in an unfolding nightmare. The mob, numbering in the thousands, descended upon Springfield with a single-minded determination, targeting not only the accused men but entire neighborhoods where black residents lived, worked, and thrived. The streets became chaotic theaters of violence as homes were looted and set ablaze. Shops were destroyed, and churches that had long served as pillars of the community were desecrated. In the midst of this terror, black residents faced impossible choices: to flee and risk being hunted by the mob, or to stand and defend their families and property against overwhelming odds. Women, and even the elderly, were forced into acts of courage that tested the limits of human endurance and ingenuity. Scott Burton, a local resident, attempted to protect his home with a shotgun, standing as a bulwark against the encroaching violence, while William Donegan, an elderly cobbler whose family ties crossed racial lines, became a tragic symbol of how fear and bigotry could warp perceptions and justify unspeakable acts. The violence was not random, yet it was indiscriminate in its cruelty, leaving death, destruction, and trauma in its wake. The aftermath of the Springfield race riot was staggering. Estimates of the death toll vary, ranging from a handful to dozens, but the human cost extended far beyond numbers. Thousands of black residents were forcibly displaced, stripped of their homes, businesses, and the fragile sense of security that had allowed them to build their lives. The financial devastation compounded the psychological and social trauma, creating a void in the community that would take generations to begin to repair. The riot exposed the deep fault lines of American society, revealing how quickly prejudice, when left unchecked, could erupt into organized violence and mass displacement, and how vulnerable communities were when the very institutions meant to protect them failed to act, or were complicit in the cruelty. Out of the ashes of Springfield arose a movement that would transform the landscape of civil rights in the United States. Witnessing the scale of the violence, the lack of accountability, and the systemic indifference to the suffering of black citizens, leaders and activists recognized the urgent need for an organized national response. The result was the founding of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People (NAP) in 1909, an organization dedicated to combating racial injustice through legal action, advocacy, and public education. The Springfield riot, therefore, was both a tragedy and a catalyst. It demonstrated the destructive power of racial hatred but also galvanized a generation to mobilize, organize, and challenge the systems that perpetuated inequality. The riot's legacy extends beyond its immediate consequences. It serves as a powerful reminder of the intersection between legal protection, public perception, and societal violence. The decision to protect two men from extrajudicial killing, an act of justice, inadvertently triggered widespread retaliation, illustrating how fragile the rule of law can be in a society steeped in fear and racial prejudice. At the same time, it highlights the courage and resilience of the black community, which, despite facing overwhelming violence, continue to fight for recognition, fairness, and the right to exist without fear. Their resistance, both in the moment and in the generations that followed, underscores the enduring human capacity for dignity and perseverance in the face of injustice. When reflecting on Springfield in the broader context of American history, it becomes clear that the riot was neither an isolated incident nor an aberration. It was part of a continuum of racial violence that connects to earlier tragedies such as the Atlanta and Rosewood massacres, and foreshadows later events like the Tulsa Massacre. Each event, while unique in its circumstances, shares common threads of fear, misinformation, and the weaponization of prejudice to justify violence, and each left communities scarred in ways that transcended the immediate loss of life and property. Yet within these stories, there is also a through line of resilience, remembrance, and activism, demonstrating that even in the darkest moments, human courage and collective action can plant the seeds for transformative change. By understanding the Springfield riot, we are called to recognize the fragile balance between justice and social fear, the enduring impact of systemic prejudice, and the importance of organized advocacy to protect vulnerable communities. It is a story of tragedy and loss, but also of awakening and determination, reminding us that history, when remembered accurately and told fully, is a powerful tool for justice, education, and the creation of a more equitable society where the rights of all individuals are respected and defended. In the turbulent years following Reconstruction, the promise of freedom and equality for Black Americans often collided violently with entrenched systems of white supremacy, revealing the fragile and contested nature of social, economic, and political advancement. Nowhere was this tension more visible than in the rural and industrial regions where black workers began to assert their rights, demanding fair wages, better working conditions, and the basic dignity of recognition in a society that had long sought to marginalize them. These efforts, though grounded in the principles of justice and fairness, were often met with hostility from white landowners, employers, and militias determined to maintain control and suppress any challenge to the established racial and economic hierarchy. The struggle for labor rights became inseparable from the broader fight for racial equality, as each act of organization, negotiation, or protest by black workers was perceived as a direct threat to white dominance, provoking violent reprisals that would leave communities devastated and futures imperiled. One of the most harrowing examples of this dynamic occurred in the early 20th century, when black sharecroppers, tenant farmers, and laborers in the South sought to collectively assert their economic power. These workers, often living under the crushing weight of discriminatory practices and exploitative contracts, began to organize, forming unions and associations to negotiate better terms with landowners who had long controlled the local economy. The plantations and fields were not just workplaces but sites of systemic oppression where every financial transaction and daily task reinforced a hierarchy designed to benefit white landowners at the expense of black laborers. The mere act of demanding fair compensation, challenging inflated prices at plantation stores, or negotiating equitable settlement of accounts was interpreted as insubordination, and those who dared to speak out were met with intimidation, threats, and ultimately, violence. In one particularly tragic instance, negotiations led by black community leaders, including teachers and union organizers, sought to secure fair wages for labor during the demanding harvest season. Their efforts, although peaceful and rooted in the shared interest of survival and sustenance, were met with outright refusal and hostility from plantation owners, who then leveraged their political connections to summon white militias and paramilitary groups to enforce submission. The arrival of armed men, some with sophisticated weaponry including Gatling guns, transformed what should have been a negotiation over labor into a full-scale assault on the black community. Women, and even children, found themselves caught in indiscriminate gunfire, as white militias and vigilante groups unleashed violence with the explicit intent of reasserting control and sending a clear message: economic agency for black workers would not be tolerated. The massacre that followed was not an isolated eruption of anger, but a calculated act of suppression designed to maintain racial and political hierarchies. Homes were burned, fields destroyed, and communities terrorized, leaving survivors traumatized and impoverished, with many fleeing to neighboring areas in search of safety. The economic impact was devastating. Decades of labor and careful cultivation were reduced to ash, while families who had dared to envision a better future were left with nothing beyond the immediate loss of life and property. The psychological toll of the attack lingered for generations, a constant reminder that the pursuit of fairness in a system built on inequality could invite deadly retaliation. The events in these rural communities also illustrate the intersection of labor disputes and political power. White militias were often deployed not only to punish black economic assertion, but to suppress political participation and maintain control over local governance. In many cases, these attacks coincided with contested elections or challenges to the political status quo, underscoring how intertwined racial, economic, and political oppression had become. Efforts by black citizens to exercise the right to vote, to engage in civic leadership, or to advocate for equitable policies were met with organized violence, intimidation, and legal obstacles, effectively silencing voices that threatened to disrupt the established order. The massacres thus functioned as both economic and political tools, ensuring that progress for black Americans remained limited, fragmented, and fraught with peril. Despite the overwhelming odds and the brutal repression, the spirit of resilience persisted among Black communities. Survivors carried forward stories of courage, documenting the atrocities through oral histories and passing them to subsequent generations, ensuring that the memory of both the struggle and the violence would not be erased. These narratives highlight the dual nature of the experience. While white militias succeeded in temporarily halting economic and political progress through terror, the community's memory, solidarity, and eventual mobilization laid the groundwork for future civil rights efforts. The echoes of these massacres can be traced to later movements that demanded justice, equality, and recognition, showing that even in the face of systematic suppression, the drive for fairness and dignity endured. Looking at these events in the broader arc of American history, it becomes evident that the struggle of Black workers was never merely about wages or land. It was a fundamental assertion of humanity, refusal to accept subjugation, and a declaration of the right to participate fully in society. The violent reprisals that met these aspirations were intended to enforce submission. Yet they also exposed the fragility of social order built on racial inequity and the inherent injustice of denying any community the opportunity to thrive. These massacres, while devastating in the immediate sense, contributed to a long-term awareness of the need for legal protections, organized advocacy, and the eventual dismantling of structures designed to suppress Black economic and political agency. The story of Black laborers and the violent opposition they faced underscores the interconnectedness of economic power, political influence, and social justice, revealing how deeply embedded prejudice shaped every aspect of life and how courage, solidarity, and memory became tools of resistance. It is a testament to the resilience of communities that, despite repeated attacks, continued to fight for their rights and laid the foundations for future generations to challenge inequality and injustice, ensuring that the lessons of the past would inform the work of building a more equitable society. In the summer of 1917, East Louis, Illinois, transformed almost overnight as waves of Black Americans migrated from the South in search of employment opportunities brought by the booming war industries. Factories and plants, desperate for labor to meet the demands of World War I production, welcomed these workers whose skills and determination promised both personal uplift and communal progress. For the Black migrants, the city represented hope, a chance to escape the rigid oppression of the Jim Crow South, to earn wages that could sustain their families, and to build communities where their children could grow up with greater opportunities. However, the arrival of these new residents, whose ambition and industry challenged the established social order, also stoked fears among white residents who perceived the demographic shift as a direct threat to their economic stability and social dominance. Tensions escalated rapidly, fueled by rumors, misinformation, and resentment. White workers, facing job competition and grappling with prejudices long cultivated by systemic racism, began to view Black newcomers not as fellow Americans pursuing livelihood, but as invaders encroaching on their territory. Local newspapers, often sympathetic to white anxieties and eager for sensational headlines, published stories exaggerating incidents, inflaming public opinion, and framing Black workers as a destabilizing force. The rhetoric of fear and suspicion set the stage for a catastrophe, one that would devastate the community and expose the fragility of law enforcement and civic protection in times of racial tension. On July 1, 1917, a white, emboldened by years of systemic inequality and a sense of impunity, erupted into violence. The mobs targeted Black neighborhoods with unrestrained aggression, looting homes, setting fires, and shooting indiscriminately at anyone who resisted or attempted to escape. Families fled for their lives, some finding temporary refuge in basements, alleys, or the few structures that had not yet been engulfed in flames. Entire blocks were reduced to rubble, leaving the landscape of East Louis scarred and desolate, and forcing thousands of black residents to abandon their homes and livelihoods in the face of relentless terror. The human toll was staggering. While estimates vary, it is widely recognized that dozens were killed, hundreds wounded, and countless more left traumatized by the violence. In the midst of this chaos, the failures of local authorities became painfully clear. Law enforcement, either unwilling or unable to intervene, allowed the mob to act with near-total impunity, and the National Guard's response was delayed and insufficient. The very institutions designed to uphold law and order instead appeared indifferent to the plight of black residents, reinforcing a devastating reality. In moments of racial conflict, systemic bias often dictated whose lives were protected and whose were expendable. The lack of intervention not only compounded the immediate suffering but also signaled to white mobs that such violence would be tolerated, perpetuating a cycle of fear and oppression that would resonate through the affected communities for decades. Amid the destruction, black residents displayed remarkable resilience, courage, and solidarity. Men and women risked their lives to rescue neighbors trapped in burning homes, to provide aid to the wounded, and to secure whatever belongings they could salvage from the wreckage. Community leaders, recognizing the urgent need for organization and advocacy, began to document the events meticulously, ensuring that the stories of suffering, heroism, and endurance would not be erased. These accounts, though painstakingly collected, revealed not only the brutality of the mob, but also the deep bonds of communal support and shared resolve that allowed survivors to endure in the aftermath of unimaginable loss. The East Louis Massacre also served as a stark illustration of the intersection between economic competition, racial prejudice, and urban unrest. The influx of black workers, seeking opportunity and security, inadvertently became a flashpoint in a broader conflict over resources, employment, and social hierarchy. The violence was as much about fear of economic displacement as it was about entrenched racial hatred, highlighting how systemic inequities and social anxieties can converge to produce catastrophic outcomes. The destruction of property and loss of life were immediate consequences, but the long-term impact on the city's black population was equally profound. Families were uprooted, businesses destroyed, and generational wealth diminished, leaving communities to rebuild from near-total devastation under the shadow of persistent threat. In reflecting on these events, it is impossible to separate the tragedy from the lessons it imparts about justice, civic responsibility, and the necessity of standing against oppression. The East Louis Massacre exemplifies how unchecked prejudice, combined with institutional failure, can escalate into violence of staggering proportions. It also underscores the enduring courage of those who, even when abandoned by authorities, chose to protect, document, and preserve their communities. The story of East Louis is a testament to both the destructive consequences of systemic racism and the resilient spirit of Black Americans who, time and again, faced the unthinkable and emerged determined to survive, remember, and continue the struggle for justice, equality, and recognition in a society that too often sought to deny them those rights. This chapter in history, when connected to the broader tapestry of racial violence across America from Atlanta to Rosewood, Springfield to Tulsa, reveals a pattern of repeated oppression, resilience, and eventual advocacy, showing that even in the darkest periods, communities could forge paths toward empowerment and mobilization for civil rights. The lessons of East Lewis endure as both warning and inspiration, reminding us that vigilance, empathy, and collective action are essential to prevent history from repeating itself, and to ensure that every citizen's rights are defended with unwavering commitment. By the late 20th century, the struggle for Black Americans had evolved but remained perilously entwined with systemic oppression, as the tragedies of the past echoed into modern urban landscapes. In Philadelphia, a city with a long and complex history of racial tension, the MOVE organization, a communal Black group advocating for social justice, environmental awareness, and communal living, found itself at the center of a catastrophic confrontation that would shock the nation and become a symbol of state-sanctioned violence against African American communities. MOVE members, committed to a philosophy of self-sufficiency and activism, had long clashed with municipal authorities over housing regulations, community standards, and city ordinances, while their intentions focused on creating an alternative lifestyle that challenged societal norms. These clashes increasingly drew the attention of law enforcement, who framed the group's presence as a threat rather than a legitimate social experiment, ignoring the broader context of racial inequities and the community's historical marginalization. Tensions escalated to a breaking point in May 1985, when authorities, under pressure to address decades of complaints and accusations against MOVE, decided on a highly aggressive intervention. Unlike prior confrontations that had relied on arrests and negotiations, city officials deployed a paramilitary-style response, including the controversial use of explosives, an extreme measure previously unheard of in domestic policing. The MOVE headquarters, located in a row house in West Philadelphia, was surrounded by police and fire personnel, marking the start of a tense and dangerous standoff that would soon spiral into disaster. Residents, including children, elders, and families who had long made the communal house their home, were caught in an escalating situation they could not control, and the resulting catastrophe would demonstrate the lethal consequences of militarized policing combined with systemic neglect and racial bias. On the day of the confrontation, police used explosives to attempt to dislodge MOVE members from the house. The strategy, justified by authorities as a tactical maneuver, immediately ignited a fire that quickly spread to adjacent buildings. In just minutes, the blaze consumed the communal house entirely, killing 11 people, including 6 adults and 5 children, while destroying 61 neighboring homes and displacing approximately 250 residents from the surrounding community. Eyewitnesses describe scenes of chaos and terror, families trapped in burning homes, neighbors fleeing through smoke-filled streets, and first responders struggling to contain a fire that had become uncontrollable. The scale of the destruction was unprecedented, and for the Black community in Philadelphia, it represented yet another chapter in a long history of targeted violence, systemic neglect, and the vulnerability of their neighborhoods to excessive force sanctioned by those in power. The MOVE bombing was not an isolated incident of urban tension. It was emblematic of the broader systemic forces that had historically marginalized Black communities, from economic disenfranchisement to political exclusion, and, in extreme cases, state-sanctioned violence. The city's decision to employ such drastic measures reflected both a failure of governance and a deep-seated bias that, consciously or unconsciously, devalued the lives of Black residents in conflict zones. The fact that children were among the victims further underscored the profound injustice and the degree to which systemic failures could result in indiscriminate tragedy. Across the city, families mourned, communities were destabilized, and the trust between Black residents and law enforcement, already fragile due to a history of discrimination and neglect, was shattered. Yet even amidst the horror, stories of courage and resilience emerged. Neighbors risked their own safety to rescue individuals trapped in adjacent homes, offering temporary shelter and aid to the displaced, while journalists and community advocates documented the destruction, ensuring that the events would not be swept under the rug. Survivors, many of whom had endured the trauma of decades of racial oppression, spoke out in subsequent years, demanding accountability, seeking justice, and preserving the memory of those lost in a fire that symbolized more than a mere confrontation. It was a stark reminder that systemic inequities could escalate to devastating consequences if unchecked. The MOVE tragedy also galvanized activists and reformers to scrutinize the use of force in urban policing, highlighting the need for transparency, accountability, and the implementation of safeguards to prevent such tragedies from occurring again, particularly in communities historically subjected to discrimination. When contextualized within the broader arc of Black American history, from the massacres in Atlanta, Rosewood, and Tulsa, to the labor-related massacres in the rural South, and the urban violence in East, Lewis, the MOVE bombing reveals the persistent patterns of systemic violence, displacement, and economic and social marginalization. While the methods of oppression evolved, the underlying dynamics remained distressingly consistent when Black communities pursued autonomy, equality, or survival. They often faced hostility from both societal structures and governmental authorities determined to maintain control. These events collectively illustrate how historical patterns of racialized violence extend beyond overt acts of mob aggression, manifesting in subtler yet equally lethal forms of institutionalized and systemic repression, where the machinery of power is wielded in ways that disproportionately harm marginalized communities. The lessons of the MOVE tragedy resonate deeply. It underscores the need for vigilance in protecting civil liberties, ensuring the ethical and accountable exercise of power by authorities, and recognizing that systemic inequities can manifest as both historical and contemporary violence. It also emphasizes the resilience of Black communities, which, despite repeated acts of oppression, have consistently preserved their histories, upheld their dignity, and fought to ensure that the stories of victims are remembered and honored. The events in Philadelphia remind us that justice, accountability, and community advocacy are not optional. They are essential to preventing the repetition of such tragedies, creating safer cities, and fostering a society in which the rights and lives of all citizens are respected. The MOVE bombing stands as a somber testament to the dangers of unchecked authority, the importance of community solidarity, and the enduring struggle for equity and recognition. It is a reminder that the pursuit of justice and protection of life must remain central to all governance, and that historical patterns of racial oppression require continued awareness, active resistance, and a commitment to change, ensuring that such preventable tragedies never happen again. As we arrive at the final chapter of this tragic yet crucial journey through America's history of racial violence, the story of Greenwood, Oklahoma, affectionately known as Black Wall Street, stands as both a cautionary tale and a testament to resilience. In the early 20th century, Greenwood was a shining example of what Black Americans could achieve despite systemic oppression. It was a thriving community, bustling with businesses, schools, churches, and cultural institutions, all built through determination, skill, and the collective effort of its residents. For Black Americans, Greenwood was more than a place to live. It was a symbol of hope, prosperity, and autonomy, a vision of what could be accomplished when a community was free from the constraints of discrimination. Yet, that vision was violently shattered in 1921, when false accusations against a young Black man ignited long-simmering racial tensions. Rumors spread rapidly, inflaming fear and prejudice among the white population. Within hours, mobs descended on Greenwood, wielding weapons, setting homes and businesses ablaze, and targeting the people who had labored for decades to create their flourishing community. The destruction was almost unimaginable. Hundreds of residents were killed, thousands were left homeless, and the thriving economy of Greenwood was reduced to ashes within mere hours. Families lost generational wealth, and survivors were forced to flee, carrying with them the trauma of what they had endured, a trauma that reverberated through their descendants for generations. What happened in Greenwood was not merely an isolated act of violence. It was part of a broader pattern of racial terror that swept across the United States. From Atlanta to Rosewood, Springfield to East Louis, and up to Philadelphia, Black Americans repeatedly faced targeted aggression simply for asserting their humanity, pursuing economic opportunity, or building communities that represented dignity and independence. The massacre of Greenwood illustrates the extreme lengths to which fear, prejudice, and systemic inequity can drive societies, leaving communities physically destroyed, emotionally scarred, and historically marginalized. It underscores how false narratives and sensationalized accusations can catalyze violence, magnifying existing societal tensions and turning progress into devastation almost overnight. Yet, amid the darkness of Greenwood's destruction, the resilience of its people stands as an enduring beacon of hope. Survivors, despite facing overwhelming loss, began the arduous work of rebuilding, demonstrating courage, determination, and an unyielding commitment to preserving their heritage. They kept the memory of their community alive, sharing stories with future generations and demanding that the truth of what happened not be forgotten or minimized. The Greenwood Massacre serves as a reminder that even in the face of extreme injustice, communities can preserve their identity, resist erasure, and advocate for acknowledgement, restitution, and healing. The lessons of Greenwood extend far beyond its immediate geographic and historical context. They remind us of the importance of truth, accountability, and historical awareness. By acknowledging the atrocities that occurred, studying their causes, and understanding the human cost, society can begin to address the enduring effects of racial violence and systemic oppression. Greenwood teaches us that economic empowerment and community cohesion are not merely individual or local achievements, they are collective victories that require protection, recognition, and continued vigilance. It also highlights the enduring need for education and public awareness, ensuring that such tragedies are neither ignored nor repeated, and that the voices of those who suffered are heard, validated, and preserved for posterity. As we reflect on Greenwood and the long trail of violence and oppression documented in this series, it is essential to recognize that these events are not just distant history, they have shaped the present, influencing contemporary struggles for equity, justice, and civil rights. The legacy of Black Wall Street, and the generational trauma it caused, continues to inform discussions about systemic racism, reparations, community empowerment, and the enduring fight for justice in America. Each story, each massacre, each act of resilience contributes to a larger narrative, one that demands recognition, reflection, and action to ensure that progress is not destroyed by fear, prejudice, or unchecked power. Thank you for joining this journey through some of the most painful yet vital chapters of American history. By learning these stories, we honor those who suffered, amplify voices that were silenced, and ensure that the lessons of the past guide us toward a more just and equitable future. If this video helped you understand the resilience, courage, and struggles of Black Americans, please like and subscribe to our channel to continue exploring these important histories. Sharing this knowledge is a step toward ensuring that such injustices are neither forgotten nor repeated, and that every community's story is valued, remembered, and respected. By engaging with this content, supporting survivors' legacies, and fostering informed discussion, we contribute to a movement that seeks awareness, justice, and systemic change. Greenwood story. While heartbreaking, is also a powerful testament to the endurance of a people who refuse to let hatred define their future. Through understanding, education, and solidarity, we can honor their courage and work toward a society where no community is ever again destroyed by fear, prejudice, or injustice. Remember, history is not just about the past, it is about learning, acting, and building a better future together. Like, share, and subscribe to continue this journey of awareness and transformation.